In the cutthroat world of political journalism, moments of authenticity are rare and precious. But when a seasoned reporter thought they had crafted the perfect trap for Usha Vance, they couldn't have anticipated how her response would transform not just the interview, but the entire narrative surrounding her campaign. Comment where you're watching from today, as we dive into one of the most unexpected moments in recent political coverage. The setting was deceptively ordinary, a sunlit campaign office in Ohio, with American flags carefully positioned in the background and campaign posters adorning the walls. The smell of coffee lingered in the air as staff members hurried about, their footsteps muffled by the carpet. Though the space hummed with activity, there was an unmistakable tension as the camera crew set up their equipment, adjusting lights and checking audio levels with practiced precision. Usha Vance entered the room with quiet confidence, her navy blazer and simple pearl earrings reflecting her trademark understated elegance. Those who knew her personal story recognized the depth behind her composed exterior. A first-generation American whose parents had immigrated from India, a Yale law graduate who had balanced a demanding legal career with raising her family, and now thrust into the unforgiving spotlight of a national campaign. But to many viewers, she remained something of an enigma, poised and articulate, yet guarded in a way that made some wonder what lay beneath the polished surface. The reporter, Morgan Phillips, had built a reputation for extracting revealing moments from even the most media-trained politicians. With 20 years of experience and a shelf of journalism awards, Phillips had perfected the art of the disarming question, the kind that seemed innocuous until the subject found themselves inadvertently revealing more than they intended. Today's interview had been difficult to secure, and Phillips had spent days preparing, identifying potential vulnerabilities, and crafting questions designed to penetrate Vance's careful composure. As the cameras began rolling, Phillips started with standard questions about policy positions and campaign strategies, merely setting the stage for what was to come. Usha responded with thoughtful, measured answers that demonstrated her command of complex issues without revealing anything particularly newsworthy. The real moment Phillips had been waiting for was still to come. "Mrs. Vance," Phillips began, leaning forward slightly, "many have noted your reluctance to engage with certain cultural issues that seem to energize your husband's base. Some critics suggest you're being strategically hidden from controversial topics because your own views might alienate voters. Are you being authentic with the American people, or are you simply playing a role in this campaign?" The question hung in the air. Campaign staffers tensed visibly, and the camera operators zoomed in slightly, anticipating a moment of discomfort or perhaps a rehearsed deflection. Phillips had deliberately framed the question as a no-win scenario. Either Vance would admit to avoiding topics, confirming the narrative of inauthenticity, or she would engage with controversial issues and potentially create damaging headlines. But Usha Vance did neither. Instead of becoming defensive or retreating into talking points, she paused, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured but carried an underlying strength that commanded attention. "That's an interesting framing, Morgan," she replied, maintaining steady eye contact. "The assumption in your question suggests that authenticity must mean performing outrage or engaging with every provocative topic that arises. My understanding of authenticity is different." Phillips hadn't expected this opening and shifted slightly in her seat as Vance continued. "I've spent my life focused on practical solutions to real problems. As a lawyer, I learned that the loudest voice isn't always the most effective one. My heritage and experience have taught me the value of listening before speaking, of building bridges rather than walls." Her voice remained calm, but gained intensity as she spoke. "When I choose which issues to address publicly, it's not about hiding, it's about prioritizing substance over spectacle." The reporter attempted to regain control of the narrative. "But surely voters deserve to know where you stand on the divisive issues that are shaping this election." Usha smiled slightly, recognizing the pivot. "Voters deserve authenticity, and that's what I offer them. My authenticity isn't measured by how many inflammatory statements I make or how well I perform outrage. It's reflected in my consistent focus on the issues that impact their daily lives: healthcare, education, economic opportunity." She leaned forward slightly, her posture relaxed yet engaged. "The narrative that a person must be provocative to be genuine is one I reject. My parents came to this country believing in the promise of America. not an America divided by manufactured outrage, but one united by shared values and aspirations. That's the conversation I choose to lead. As she spoke, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The staff members, who had been watching nervously, now stood straighter, their expressions reflecting a mixture of pride and relief. Even the camera operator seemed captivated, the lens remaining steadily focused on Vance's face as she articulated her philosophy with quiet conviction. Phillips, sensing that the trap had not only failed, but was being dismantled before a national audience, attempted to redirect. Some would argue that avoiding controversial topics is itself a political calculation. "I don't avoid controversy when it matters," Vance replied, her tone still measured but firm. "What I avoid is treating serious issues as entertainment or reducing complex problems to sound bites. The American people deserve better than that." As the interview continued, it became increasingly clear that Phillips had miscalculated. Rather than exposing a carefully constructed facade, the challenging questions had given Usha Vance an opportunity to demonstrate an authenticity that was deeper and more nuanced than the reporter had anticipated. Her refusal to be pushed into performative outrage or defensive posturing revealed a different kind of political presence, one characterized by thoughtfulness rather than theatrics. The crew, who had witnessed countless political interviews, exchanged glances that acknowledged they were witnessing something unusual. Instead of the typical dance of evasion and pursuit that characterized most political exchanges, this was evolving into a genuine conversation about the nature of public service and personal integrity. What had begun as an attempt to expose inconsistencies was transforming into a showcase for Vance's particular strength, her ability to engage with challenging questions in a way that revealed character rather than concealed it. As the first segment of the interview drew to a close, it was Phillips, not Vance, who seemed slightly off balance, recalibrating for what was clearly not going to be the gotcha moment originally planned. The seeds of a narrative shift had been planted, not through carefully crafted messaging or dramatic declarations, but through an authentic response that challenged the very premise of the trap that had been set. And as the cameras continued rolling, both the reporter and the viewing audience were about to discover that this was just the beginning of how Usha Vance would redefine expectations and transform the conversation. As the interview resumed, viewers across the country leaned closer to their screens, sensing they were witnessing something rare in modern political coverage, an exchange where the usual script had been abandoned. Phillips, known for maintaining control of interviews, was visibly recalibrating their approach, shuffling notes while the camera lingered on Vance's composed expression. "Let's talk about your background as a Yale-educated lawyer," Phillips continued, shifting tactics. "Critics suggest your elite credentials make you disconnected from the everyday struggles of working-class Americans, the very voters your campaign needs to win over. How do you respond to the perception that your privileged journey creates a fundamental disconnect?" The question was designed to place Vance in another double bind: acknowledge privilege and appear out of touch, or deny it and seem disingenuous. Several campaign staffers exchanged worried glances, but Vance herself remained unruffled. "My education is part of my story, but it's not the whole story," she responded, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine reflection. "My parents came to this country with little more than hope and determination. They worked multiple jobs to create opportunities for our family. I'm deeply aware that my path was built on their sacrifices." She paused briefly, her expression thoughtful. "But you're asking an important question about connection. What connects us to others isn't always shared circumstances. Sometimes it's shared values. My parents taught me that education wasn't just about personal advancement, but about gaining skills to serve others. That's a value that resonates across economic backgrounds." Phillips pressed further. "But can someone who's never worried about making rent or paying medical bills truly understand the urgency of these issues for ordinary Americans?" "Understanding comes in many forms," Vance replied. "I've been fortunate in many ways, and I acknowledge that privilege. But empathy isn't limited by personal experience. It's expanded by listening deeply to others' stories and recognizing our shared humanity. Throughout my legal career, I've worked with clients from all walks of life, and what I've found is that genuine respect and attentive listening bridge more gaps than we might imagine. She continued with increasing conviction. The assumption that only those who have personally experienced hardship can address it effectively underestimates our capacity for empathy and understanding. It also dismisses the contributions of many leaders throughout history who advocated for changes they wouldn't personally benefit from. As she spoke, the camera captured something shifting in Phillips's expression, a grudging respect beginning to replace the tactical calculation. The reporter had expected defensive deflection, but was instead encountering thoughtful engagement that refused to accept the premises of divisive questioning. Your campaign has largely avoided the inflammatory rhetoric that characterizes much of today's political discourse, Phillips observed, attempting another angle. Some might see this as refreshing, while others view it as avoiding taking clear stands on difficult issues. Are you trying to have it both ways? Vance smiled slightly, recognizing the pattern. There's an interesting assumption in our political culture that strength is measured by how forcefully you attack others or how absolute your positions are. I challenge that assumption. Certainty makes for good sound bites, but governance requires nuance and the ability to consider multiple perspectives. She leaned forward, her gestures measured but conveying conviction. Taking a clear stand doesn't require inflammatory language. In fact, heated rhetoric often obscures rather than clarifies where someone truly stands. My positions are available for anyone to examine. They're detailed, specific, and reflect careful consideration rather than reactive emotion. Phillips, sensing that the standard approach wasn't yielding the expected results, shifted to more personal territory. Your role in this campaign has been described as complementary to your husband's more confrontational style. Does it bother you that some view you as simply the softer side of the ticket rather than a political force in your own right? For the first time, a brief flash of emotion crossed Vance's face. Not anger or defensiveness, but something more like amused recognition. When she responded, her voice carried a new note of directness. Morgan, that framing reveals more about our culture's limited understanding of strength than it does about my role in this campaign, she replied. The notion that only confrontation signifies political power is precisely the misconception I'm challenging. Building consensus, finding common ground, articulating nuanced positions, these require tremendous political skill and fortitude. She continued with quiet intensity. Throughout history, some of our most effective leaders have been those who could calm troubled waters rather than create more turbulence. I bring different strengths to this campaign, certainly, but different doesn't mean lesser. The camera captured Phillips, nodding almost imperceptibly, the reporter's professional mask momentarily slipping to reveal genuine engagement with the response. What had begun as an attempt to corner Vance was evolving into a conversation that challenged fundamental assumptions about political communication and leadership. You've spoken about the importance of civility in political discourse, Phillips noted, but critics argue that calls for civility often privilege comfort over justice and can silence necessary expressions of outrage. How do you respond to that critique? That's a thoughtful question, Vance acknowledged. Civility isn't about avoiding difficult truths or suppressing justified concerns. It's about creating space where those concerns can be heard and addressed productively. When discourse devolves into personal attacks and reflexive outrage, we lose the ability to find solutions. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Justice requires both moral clarity and effective action. In my experience, sustainable progress comes not from momentary expressions of anger, however justified they might be, but from the patient, persistent work of building understanding and creating coalitions for change. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room continued to transform. Campaign staff who had entered the interview, braced for damage control, were now watching with evident pride. The camera operator, who had witnessed countless political exchanges, lingered on shots that captured Vance's thoughtful expressions, recognizing the uniqueness of what was unfolding. Phillips, a veteran of political interviews, found herself engaged in a conversation unlike the predictable exchanges that dominated cable news. The trap questions, designed to provoke defensive or revealing reactions, were instead opening doors to substantive discussion that transcended the usual partisan boundaries. We're almost out of time, Phillips noted, but I'd like to ask one final question. In today's polarized environment, Do you believe it's still possible to change people's minds on divisive issues, or are we simply speaking to our respective bases? Vance's expression brightened with what appeared to be genuine optimism. Not only possible, but essential, she replied. Most Americans are not defined by ideological extremes. They're concerned about their families, their communities, their futures. When we speak to those shared concerns with respect and authenticity, we create possibilities for genuine connection across apparent divides. As the interview concluded, both Vance and Phillips knew that something unexpected had occurred. What had been planned as a challenging interrogation had transformed into a showcase for a different kind of political presence, one that refused to accept the terms of division and instead offered a vision of leadership grounded in thoughtful engagement rather than reactive performance. The interview with Usha Vance was scheduled to air the following evening, and in the newsroom, an unusual debate was unfolding. The production team, gathered around monitors displaying the raw footage, found themselves divided over how to frame the segment. For Phillips, who had built a career on extracting revealing moments from politicians, this presented an unexpected dilemma. "We didn't get the confrontational moment we anticipated," one producer argued, "but we got something potentially more valuable, a genuine exchange that challenges the standard political narrative." Phillips, who had arrived at the studio expecting to edit a very different piece, sat quietly reviewing notes before speaking. "We went in looking for contradictions and evasions. What we found was consistency and directness, just not in the form we're accustomed to recognizing." The network executives, initially expecting a headline-generating confrontation, were now considering a different approach altogether. The footage revealed not a politician caught in contradictions, but one who systematically dismantled the premises of divisive questioning. In an era of predictable political theater, this represented something novel and potentially compelling. "The story isn't that she avoided the trap," Phillips finally concluded. "It's that she transformed it into something else entirely." As the production team began the editing process, they made an unusual decision: to preserve the integrity of the exchange rather than extracting sound bites designed for maximum impact. The resulting segment, when it aired the following evening, generated an immediate and intense response from viewers across the political spectrum. Social media platforms erupted with clips from the interview. Political commentators, accustomed to analyzing familiar patterns of attack and defense, found themselves discussing something more nuanced: the effectiveness of Vance's approach in diffusing antagonism without surrendering substance. "What we witnessed wasn't the absence of conviction," noted one respected political analyst, "but rather conviction expressed through a different register. In refusing to adopt the combative stance we've come to expect from politicians, Vance demonstrated that strength can take forms other than confrontation." Conservative commentators, who might have criticized a more liberal candidate for similar responses, found themselves in the unusual position of acknowledging the effectiveness of Vance's approach. "She never took the bait," observed one prominent conservative voice, "but neither did she retreat from her positions. That represents a kind of political courage we don't often recognize." Progressive voices, while noting policy disagreements, acknowledged the refreshing nature of the exchange. "The absence of demonization doesn't mean the absence of clear values," wrote one influential progressive columnist. Vance demonstrated that it's possible to advocate for conservative positions without resorting to divisive rhetoric, a distinction that matters greatly in our current climate. For ordinary viewers, the interview resonated in more personal ways. Comment sections filled with reflections not just on politics, but on communication itself. "Watching her respond to those questions reminded me of conversations with family members across political divides," wrote one viewer. "It's not about avoiding difficult topics, but approaching them in ways that preserve relationship while addressing real differences." 3 days after the interview aired, an unexpected development further transformed the narrative. A behind-the-scenes video, recorded by a junior staff member at the campaign office, began circulating online. It captured moments immediately before and after the formal interview: Phillips and Vance chatting casually as microphones were adjusted, and later continuing their conversation after cameras had officially stopped rolling. What struck viewers was the natural rapport between the two women, the mutual respect evident in their body language and the genuine engagement in their off-camera discussion. Here was Phillips, asking about Vance's family with genuine interest. Here was Vance, inquiring about Phillips's experience covering previous campaigns with obvious curiosity. The footage humanized both women, revealing them not as adversaries engaged in political combat, but as professionals with different roles finding common ground in their commitment to meaningful discourse. This glimpse behind the curtain resonated with an audience weary of performative conflict, suggesting the possibility of engagement across differences that didn't require abandoning principle. As the interview continued to generate discussion, campaign strategists from both parties noted with interest the public's response. The conventional wisdom that confrontation generates engagement, that sharp divisions drive viewer interest, was being challenged by the sustained attention this more nuanced exchange had commanded. Media analysts began questioning long-held assumptions about political coverage. "We've operated on the premise that conflict drives viewership," noted one veteran media critic. But the response to this interview suggests there may be a substantial audience hungry for substantive engagement that doesn't devolve into predictable patterns of attack and defense. For Usha Vance, the impact extended beyond mere positive coverage. Campaign events in the days following the interview saw increased attendance, with many attendees specifically mentioning the interview as what had drawn their interest. More striking was the composition of these crowds, not just committed supporters, but curious voters spanning a broader political spectrum than typically seen at campaign events. "I disagree with many of her positions," one attendee told a local reporter, "but I appreciate her approach to discussion. I wanted to hear more of that perspective firsthand." Behind the scenes, the campaign recognized the significance of this moment. What had been anticipated as a challenging interview to be carefully managed had instead become a showcase for Vance's particular strengths. The communications team, which had prepared extensive talking points and defensive strategies, found themselves in the unusual position of simply letting Vance's natural communication style take center stage. 2 weeks after the interview aired, Phillips published a reflective piece about the experience. "In preparing to interview Usha Vance," she wrote, "I approached the task with the familiar tools of my profession, identifying potential contradictions, crafting questions designed to reveal inconsistencies, seeking the moments of tension that often generate headlines. What I encountered instead was a reminder that the most revealing moments sometimes come not from trapping someone in contradiction, but from giving them space to articulate their authentic perspective." For viewers across the country, the exchange represented something both refreshing and profound, a glimpse of what political discourse might look like when freed from the constraints of performative confrontation. It challenged the cynical assumption that authenticity in politics must take the form of unfiltered aggression or theatrical outrage. As one commentator observed, in an era where political strength is often measured by how effectively one attacks opponents, Vance demonstrated a different kind of strength, the ability to engage with challenging questions in ways that build bridges rather than walls. That approach may not fit our preconceptions about political power, but it may be exactly what our divided discourse most needs. The story of the interview that transformed a narrative continued to evolve, suggesting that perhaps the most powerful response to a trap is not evasion or counterattack, but transformation, turning the moment into an opportunity for genuine connection that transcends the expected script of political confrontation. 6 weeks after the interview aired, political analysts were still discussing its impact on the broader campaign narrative. What had begun as a single media moment had evolved into something more significant, a case study in how authentic communication could reshape political discourse. Campaign strategists on both sides of the aisle were examining the phenomenon, trying to understand exactly what had resonated so deeply with voters. The Vance effect, as some commentators had begun calling it, manifested in unexpected ways across the political landscape. Viewership statistics revealed something surprising. While provocative political exchanges typically generated brief spikes in attention followed by rapid drop-offs, the Vance interview had demonstrated remarkable staying power, with viewership of the full segment continuing to grow weeks after its initial broadcast. We're seeing evidence of viewers returning to watch multiple times, sharing specific segments, and engaging in substantive discussion rather than reactive commentary, noted one digital media analyst. That pattern suggests this content is meeting a different need than the typical political exchange. Perhaps most telling was the impact on subsequent political interviews. Producers and reporters, noting the public response, began questioning their default approaches. Several prominent journalists had publicly reflected on their own interviewing techniques, acknowledging the limitations of the gotcha format that had dominated political coverage for decades. The premise of the trap question is that politicians are hiding their true positions, wrote one veteran political reporter. But what the Vance interview revealed is that sometimes our questioning format itself prevents the very authenticity we claim to be seeking. This shift extended beyond media circles into the campaigns themselves. Advisors who had long counseled candidates to stick rigidly to talking points, avoid direct answers to challenging questions, and prioritize brief, quotable statements over nuanced explanation found themselves confronting evidence that voters might be hungering for something different. At a strategy session for an opposing campaign, a senior advisor presented data that couldn't be ignored. Our focus groups show that even voters who disagree with Vance's positions responded positively to her communication style, the advisor reported. They used words like respectful, thoughtful, and honest, and indicated this approach made them more willing to consider perspectives different from their own. For Usha Vance herself, the aftermath of the interview brought both opportunity and challenge. The positive response had created a platform for more substantive engagement with voters, but it had also raised expectations. Audiences now came to her events, anticipating the same thoughtful, nuanced perspective that had characterized the interview, requiring a level of consistent authenticity that no media training could fabricate. What's remarkable is that she hasn't changed her approach, observed one longtime political correspondent who had covered Vance before her national prominence. The style that's now being celebrated as revolutionary is actually how she's always engaged with complex issues. The difference is that now, people are actually paying attention to substance over spectacle. This observation pointed to perhaps the most significant aspect of the transformed narrative. It challenged fundamental assumptions about what voters valued in political communication. The conventional wisdom that audiences craved conflict, simplistic messaging, and emotional provocation was being tested by the sustained public interest in a very different model of engagement. 3 months after the interview, Phillips and Vance reunited for a public conversation at a university forum on civil discourse in democracy. The event, which sold out within hours of being announced, brought together students, faculty, and community members from across the political spectrum. On stage, the two women reflected on their unexpected journey from what was planned as a conventional political interview to what had become a touchstone in discussions about political communication. "I've spent my career asking difficult questions," Phillips acknowledged to the audience, "but this experience reminded me that the most revealing answers often come not from trapping someone, but from creating space for genuine reflection." Vance nodded in agreement. "The assumption that authenticity must take the form of unfiltered reaction does a disservice to both candidates and voters," she observed. "Some of the most authentic moments in leadership come through thoughtful consideration rather than immediate response." The conversation moved beyond the interview itself to explore broader questions about democracy, media, and public discourse. Students pressed both women on practical strategies for communicating across deep divisions, while community leaders sought insights into rebuilding trust in institutions. Throughout the exchange, what emerged most clearly was a shared commitment to the idea that democracy required not just the expression of different viewpoints, but the development of frameworks that allowed those viewpoints to be heard and understood across lines of difference. "The greatest threat to democracy isn't disagreement," Vance noted at one point, drawing thoughtful nods from audience members across the political spectrum. "It's the loss of our capacity to disagree while still recognizing each other's fundamental humanity and good faith." As the event concluded, a student asked perhaps the most challenging question of the evening: "Can this approach really work in our current political environment? Don't candidates who refuse to engage in aggressive attacks put themselves at a disadvantage?" Phillips looked to Vance, curious about her response to this practical concern. "That's the question I'm often asked by those who appreciate what we're trying to do, but doubt its political viability," Vance acknowledged. "My answer is that we don't know unless we try." The assumption that voters will only respond to conflict and simplistic messaging is just that, an assumption. What if we've underestimated the public's capacity for nuance? What if we've confused strategies that capture momentary attention with approaches that build lasting engagement? She paused, then continued with quiet conviction. The metrics we use to measure political success matter enormously. If we define success solely by who can generate the most outrage or deliver the most devastating attack, then yes, this approach may seem impractical. But if we measure success by our ability to actually govern effectively across differences, to build coalitions for meaningful change, to restore faith in democratic institutions, then perhaps this is the most practical approach of all. As the forum ended and attendees gathered in small groups to continue the discussion, it was clear that something significant had occurred. What had begun as a reporter's attempt to trap a candidate in contradiction had evolved into a catalyst for reimagining political engagement, not through grand declarations or policy pronouncements, but through the simple, powerful demonstration that authentic communication could transcend the expected patterns of political conflict. For viewers who had followed this story from its beginning, the message was both challenging and hopeful. In a political landscape often defined by division, the transformed narrative suggested that perhaps our deepest hunger was not for combat, but for conversation. Not for victories over opponents, but for a shared vision of democracy, resilient enough to embrace our differences while affirming our common humanity.